in Maine. And I had a lovely conversation with you, Patrick, to get a little bit of background. We're so glad to have you join us today. And I don't know if you had prepared something formal or I had sent you some questions. We can sort of have a conversation, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, good morning. Thank you. Yes, I'm Patrick Walsh, and I have prepared something formal.
Perfect.
And but we'll see. It's a lot. It's a big story, and I can only do this by reading. So sometimes my head is going to be down. I hope that won't be distracting. But when I spoke with you about the possibility of meeting with all of the victim advocates today, I agreed readily, and in fact, I felt enthusiastic about it. But after a brief period of time, doubts began to set in. So it's been a very long time since I was engaged in the work of victim witness advocacy. And as an older retired person who's withdrawn from significant contact with the world because of the pandemic, my initial instinct about this presentation was to share stories of my days in advocacy from 40 years ago. But then I had the realization that my stories, even from long ago, may be very like the stories of the folks on this call. Unfortunately, victimization continues to happen. And when possible, criminal charges are brought, and advocates like you use your skills to help and support those affected. I have a vague memory from my working years of the annual Crime Victims' Rights Week. Because I looked it up, I know now that the first observance was in 1981. I have no current memory of making an effort during prior iterations of this observance to get the message out in an effort to rally our communities. It made me a little sad, in fact, to read this in Inclusion for All. I'm guessing that in one version or another, those goals haven't changed much over the last 41 years. But then we just celebrated Earth Day after more than 50 years of observance. And I have to wonder if we would be any worse off if we had not bothered to declare and annually bring attention to Earth Day. In another phase of my work life, I made efforts to prevent child abuse and neglect. The national observance of April as National Child Abuse Prevention Month began in 1983. And just as with Crime Victims' Rights Week, benefits from a governor's proclamation. I have to ask, do these official designations of days, weeks, or months offer any hope for meaningful change? What are we doing to effectively support crime victims' rights, save an increasingly vulnerable and inhospitable planet, and eliminate child abuse and neglect? Can we in fact hope to eliminate criminal victimization in our communities, eliminate child abuse and neglect? Any ideas about how to set it up, how to step it up on those efforts beyond these official observances? And maybe you're all actively engaged in efforts that I know nothing about. You probably read that a 50-year-old man set himself on fire in front of the Supreme Court on Earth Day. It's being said that he wanted to bring attention to concern for the health of the planet. Who might be influenced to act in response to his action, and what will their responses be? To prepare myself for today's meeting, I did some reading, and I can say with some confidence that victim witness advocate programs materialized in the early 1970s, with the earliest examples being those offering support for victims of sexual assault. Advocacy programs spread in popularity, and by 1974, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA, part of the US Department of Justice, began to make grants to prosecutors' offices and local governments to fund the delivery of crime victim assistance programs. Maybe you know all this history. Bear with me. In 1978, John Atwood, then the head of the criminal division of the Maine Attorney General's office, announced that he intended to run for the office of District Attorney for Prosecutorial District 6, Waldo, Knox, Lincoln, and Saginaw counties. Mr. Atwood defeated another candidate in a June primary and then won the election unopposed in November. In a recent phone call with Kara, I referred to a boast that I had sometimes made about being the fulfillment of a campaign promise in 1978 by Mr. Atwood, but I couldn't recall ever hearing or reading the details of that promise. I knew that he had been a prosecutor of homicide cases obviously high profile, consequential cases, and reliant on survivor and witness testimony. He would naturally be attuned to the needs of these critical witnesses who were asked to give of their time and perform in high stress environments in order for the state to present a fair trial and secure a conviction. When he took the post of DA in January 1979, the Rockland Courier-Gazette reported, quote, "Atwood's plan for a victim assistance project is proceeding on schedule, pending approval of matching funds by the county commissioners and the legislative delegation in Saginaw County. Atwood is hopeful that this type of program and effective consistent prosecution of criminal cases will serve the public well during the 4 years of his administration. Although I spent some time searching in the old news, I couldn't find reports of the specific campaign promises, which might have included references to the VWA project he envisioned. But it was clear that after the election, he began to work to locate funding and earn local support for the VWA program, even before his term began. Funding was eventually granted from the aforementioned Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. In February, 5 weeks after he took office, the Courier-Gazette reported on DA Atwood's meeting with the Mid-Coast Law Enforcement Association, with representatives from all four of the district's counties. Included in the report was this quote, that unlike most campaign promises that are frequently forgotten in the aftermath, he has every intention of keeping his. It's time, quoting Mr. Atwood, that some thought and consideration be given to the other victims of crimes, the actual victims and the witnesses. They should have the opportunity, the advantages of the defendant in the criminal process. I would like to see this almost ignored segment of our society be given equal rights. Why not a preview of trial proceedings? How many witness victims go into court for the first time in their lives, almost totally unaware of legal procedures? They are intimidated by the very atmosphere of the courts. Then there's the matter of recompense. I don't expect the legal system to pay them for doing their duty or because they are victims, but consideration should be given to people who spend time away from their jobs, homes, and families in order to be responsible citizens. A reminder that this was a public pronouncement from a newly elected DA more than 43 years ago. Finding this news recently was enlightening to me, particularly his call for equal rights of victims and defendants. Somehow in early 1979, I learned of the job opening. And although I could not find a help wanted ad in the old newspapers, I'm not certain how the job was described. I quite obviously applied and was invited to an interview. The interview team consisted of the DA, his assistant for Waldo County, William Anderson, now a Superior Court judge, his prosecutorial assistant in Knox County, Dr. Earl Mino, and Barbara DeGolier, the new victim witness advocate in Penobscot County, working for DA David Cox. I believe that she may have been the first victim witness advocate in the state, but it's possible that representatives from Penobscot County know that history. I have a little memory of what I was asked during the interview, but for some reason, I was offered the position. My history in law was very minor. After graduating from college in 1971 with a BA in psychology, I lived in Chicago for a couple of years and worked at Loyola University in their bookstore. I handled a lot of law books, but I didn't crack many of those law books. Arriving in Maine in 1974, I first landed in Aroostook County. Not easy to find work in Aroostook County, including back then in 1974. And I wound up applying for a job at Pine Tree Legal Assistance in Presque Isle, didn't get the job. It was made clear to me that preference was given to local applicants for most work in Aroostook and not come from a ways. I understood that. So I ended up working on a potato farm in Fort Fairfield, working alongside a team of seasonal workers who lived at or near the poverty line, hardworking, dependable, and spirited people. I moved to Waldo County in 1976 and was hired as ombudsman for a community action agency that provided an array of anti-poverty programs. I assisted individuals and families who were struggling to stay afloat. That included helping to guide people through applications for various kinds of assistance and provided support in filing an appeal. The work took me into small claims court, helping in utility shutoff cases, tenant landlord disputes, which in one case led to a filing of an action in Superior Court alleging violations of Maine's new warranties of habitability law with the support of Pine Tree Legal Assistance. So my deficits were a short time in Maine, a shorter time in Waldo County, and no experience in the realm of criminal law. On the upside, I had experience working with people experiencing poverty and in challenging conditions, and who were sometimes in need of an advocate. I was offered the VWA position and reported for my first day of work on April 17th, 1979, 43 years ago. The salary was $9,000, that's per year, and it was welcome. My wife and I had purchased a home about a year and a half before, and we were expecting our first child in 2 months. So having a full-time job was a good deal. I wouldn't have been deterred by the fact that it was a grant-funded job, even though my prior work, also grant-funded, ended when the money ran out. I mentioned earlier in the interview that the person who I believe was the first victimless advocate in Maine, Barbara DeGollier, we had a brief conversation, and I understood that at that time she was working with Bangor and Brewer PDs and was spending time doing ride-alongs with police officers. I thought this was unusual, but it may have advantages of informing one about police procedure and also in meeting victims very early on, crime victims. I arrived for the first day of my new job, shown to a very small office that was behind the legal secretary space. While trying to become acquainted with my multi-line phone that first morning, I was asked to come into Mr. Atwood's office. He introduced me to a couple whose 7-year-old son had been molested by a man recently released from the Maine State Prison. I will never forget that Mr. Atwood told these parents, Mr. Walsh is going to support your son and your family through the criminal process. I don't ever recall receiving a job description, but that introduction made it very clear that I needed to learn a lot and learn it fast if I was going to be effective in living out the vision that Mr. Atwood had for the program. It was a benefit to me, I have to admit, that no one else had held the position. There were no preconceived notions, no precedents. So it was easy to step in and create a position that was satisfactory to the procedures of the office and to the district attorney. I was responsible at first for 2 counties, Knox and Waldo, and I needed to fairly balance where I spent my time to be both accessible and productive. I lived in Waldo County, just a few miles from the courthouse in Belfast, but it was a far longer commute to the office in Rockland, the DA's primary office. Shortly after my start, Waldo County had a scheduled term of Superior Court. This would be my first. In preparation, I began contacting witnesses and hearing general complaint of, again? I learned that in the absence of a staff person who could provide information about the expected court schedule and set up an alert system, the practice had been to serve subpoenas on everyone on the witness list for all the trials on the docket. Understandably, people were upset about being required to attend court, sitting there with nothing to do and with little information before being told that they could go. I remember one person, a witness in a serious arson case, informed me that he had spent 11 days at court over 3 successive terms and not been called to participate in the trial. One easy and cost-effective change that we were able to make was in scheduling and notification of witnesses, which saved more than $5,000 in witness fees in that first year. I think that witness fees then were only $5 a day. Better logistical planning meant that we were able to focus more specific attention on the victims in those serious crimes, which was respectful and more likely to ensure their cooperation. Another of Mr. Atwood's promises was to have a fully staffed office in each of the counties in his district. And so we had a full-time assistant DA covering Waldo County. And that meant that the assistant and the office had continuous relationships with law enforcement and citizens participating in our cases. There were times when assistant AGs came to help cover district court while our assistant DA was needed in Superior Court. One memorable day, a young blonde-haired woman, an assistant AG, came to Belfast District Court to handle that day's cases. A sheriff's deputy present offered what he thought was a friendly quip to the effect, "Finally, we've got a good-looking prosecutor to handle court." The woman pointedly responded, "If I want to hear you bark, I'll pull your chain." That was Janet Mills. Shortly after I started, the district was able to hire another advocate to be responsible for the work in Lincoln and Saginaw counties. I don't think I had so much of a head start that I could help get her oriented, but we did confer and provided mutual support in our learning. We were pretty alone in this work. I did hear about another victim witness advocate in Androscoggin County and reached out. I remember his name as Billy Allison or Ellison, and learned that most of his work was focused on the logistics side of lining up witnesses and getting subpoenas out. Maybe folks from Androscoggin County know this history. You're probably aware that in 1979, we didn't have things in our office called technology. So there were no computers, no cell phones or smartphones, no email, no text, no GPS. We found our way around to home visits by stopping and asking for directions randomly. How do I get to the Walsh Road? And never saying which house we were looking for in order to protect confidentiality. I tried to do a lot of home visits if people welcomed me, and the tie that I wore at the office got thrown in the back seat of the car before I went to that meeting in order to be informal, while at the same time, hopefully being informative. We had barely functioning photocopiers, and it took a while for fax machines to be available. Most people did not have voicemail or even answering machines on their landlines, so that trying to reach someone sometimes meant trying to make phone calls after hours to catch people after work. Some printed forms could be completed with the use of a typewriter. Some of you have had experience with typewriters. Mistakes had to be whited out or the form restarted. When I was collecting restitution payments, the means of keeping track was through a use of a large ledger book. I was given a gift of a small solar-powered calculator, which is still working to this day, with which to make basic financial calculations. I understand that prior to my employment, restitution was usually ordered to be collected by probation officers, and I think they welcomed handing that responsibility off. I found in some old notes that I had during the 7.5 years I spent on this work, I was able to collect and return in excess of $100,000. So that was a big deal in order to get that money back to victims. Without a computer or word processor early on, notes from the case files were handwritten. And because I've never had clear handwriting, I printed everything, usually all in caps. I accepted that was the best way for me to share my thoughts or information in a legible way, but it did look like the work of a fifth grader. My early BWA years coincided with the growth of sexual assault support and domestic violence support groups. We connected with those groups locally, participated in volunteer trainings, provided information about how to find help for those in need. By 1985, child abuse and neglect prevention councils were forming in both my counties and, in fact, the other two counties in the district as well, to provide parent education, family support, public information awareness initiatives. We sat on boards and participated in joint training and awareness activities. After nearly 7.5 years as a VWA, I decided to leave. By that time, in 1986, additional grant funds made available through VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, made it possible to hire additional advocates and to designate one advocate in each county to focus specifically on child abuse cases. So that by the time I left, there were 4 advocates, 2 in each county, where I had previously been responsible. My decision to leave was partly in response to my stress reaction to the work, to allow more time with my 2 young sons, and to make it possible for my wife, who had dedicated so much home parenting time, to expand her paid work to full time. After a little while, I was hired to be first director part-time at the Waldo County Child and Parent Council to focus on preventing child abuse and neglect. Among our first actions was opening a parent resource center with a core program for parenting teens. Many of the young women we worked with have been sexually abused. The fathers of their children often continued their victimization. They were older, as much as 10 years older or more, and they abandoned that relationship after the child was born, taking no responsibility. So we focused on informing young women about child development, important nutrition, including meal preparation, so that we could have group meals together, something which their families might not have experienced. We focused on informing about child development. I'm sorry I said that. We provided donated furniture, infant and children's clothing, bedding, books, etc. As to the comment about work-related stress, when I started the new job, I made it a point to speak publicly about what I had seen as the problem of child abuse and neglect. Invited to speak at a local service club meeting about our work to prevent child abuse, I was chagrined to see that some members of the club were quite affected by the social drinking that took place before the start of the program. I hope none of you have had that experience in public presentations that you've been asked to do. As I launched into my talk, I offered some detail about a young teen who revealed a sexual abuse history by a man she thought to be her father. Because of her mother's unsupportive response, she was removed from her home to a foster care placement in another county. In her first year in high school, she had to transfer to a new school in the community where the foster home was located. Shortly after, the foster parents became concerned that there seemed to be a relationship developing between the girl and their teenage son. No one apparently thought of this ahead of time, and they insisted that she be moved. This was accomplished with a move to another home and transferred to another school. When it was learned that she was attending group therapy with other survivors of sexual abuse, it was decided that she should withdraw from the group so that her future testimony would not be tainted by other stories. Somewhere during this recitation to what I was now hoping was a more sober audience, I became overcome with emotion and started to cry, an embarrassing experience. I have since learned about secondary trauma, and I understood that I, and of course you, can only take on so much of the heartache and pain felt by these people whom we try to support without being deeply affected by it. And the stress reaction can leak out at inconvenient times. I can only hope that our integrated child protective systems have made this young woman's experience less likely to be repeated. My work took a turn when my local legislative representative, in fact, the House Majority Leader, made a comment concerning a criminal case brought in Waldo County against the Deputy Commissioner of Human Services, who was charged with sexually abusing his stepdaughter. The representative said, and I'm paraphrasing, "We need to find out who it was in the district attorney's office who told this little girl what to say." I was sick of that kind of sentiment, and I knew that was not true. It irked me to the point that I decided that I would campaign for his House seat. So for several months, I was trying to work part-time to prevent child abuse and neglect, look after my kids after school, and campaign across the 10-town district that I would represent if elected. I didn't win. But during the course of this hectic period, another job opened up in the Knox County DA's office, the job of prosecutorial assistant. I was hired, I applied and was hired, and I began this new job in January 1990. A failed Democratic legislative candidate working for an elected Republican DA. This apparently caused some irritation in local partisan political circles, but the DA, a former assistant to Mr. Atwood, assured them that having worked with me previously, he was confident in my ability to do the work without political prejudice. The prosecutorial assistant position was quite different and was meant to work with police officers who may have believed that making an arrest in a case cleared the case in a way that meant they could pass it along to the DA's office. We scrutinized those cases in a way that was intended to help the officer through questions to conduct more complete investigations and provide necessary evidence that would be more likely to secure a conviction. I continued in that position for another 8.5 years, during which I had the opportunity to work with some terrific victim witness advocates who succeeded me. including Stephanie Late, who is still on the job and may be on this call. And a shout out to Stephanie if you're there. You'll hopefully remember that at the beginning of these remarks, I quoted DA Atwood, who remarked on the goals of his vision of a VWA program. Speaking of victims and witnesses, they should have the opportunity, the advantages of the defendant criminal process. I would like to see this almost ignored. Equality is not the same as equity. The term equity in the current theme for National Crime Victims' Rights Week talks about respect and information and doesn't get to equality. Mr. Atwood's not here to clarify or further explain what he hoped for. In my experience of 40 years ago, I remember that victims were most likely to be questioning and critical of the rights afforded the defendant. These may sound like things that you've heard. Why does it take so long? How can they keep delaying things? Why do I have to testify when he or she doesn't have to? They can just sit there and look at me and not have to say a thing. How come they confess, but that can't be used against them to show that they are guilty? Why can't my stolen property held as evidence be returned? I'm suspecting, again, that you may have become accustomed to hearing such things. We know that the rights afforded to the accused are concrete and found in the amendments to the US Constitution. The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th amendments are specific to protecting the rights of those accused of crimes. It's fair to say that you won't find in the Constitution rights of those accused of victims of crimes. Several states have, as you're likely aware, taken steps to amend their constitutions. And in the interest of time, I'll skip some of what I had here, but those efforts to amend state constitutions began in California in 2008. There was known as Marsy's Law. I noticed from a little bit of superficial research that in 2017 and 2018, there was a movement, and there still is an active website called Marsy's Law in Maine. There was legislation that would have created a constitutional amendment in Maine, or at least a vehicle to go out to the community for approval to the amendment. The difference between what I saw happening with Marsy's Law, in, again, a little bit of research, was that those parties who were supporting that, looking to make sure that those constitutional rights were enforceable. I guess you could interpret that in many ways. But the Maine law, which apparently died at the end of the legislative session in 2018, says this resolution does not provide a victim a cause of action for compensation or damages against the state or a political subdivision of the state, including the courts or any officer, employee, or agent of the state or a political subdivision of the state. I don't know then what the enforceability of constitutional rights as specified in this bill from 2017. I don't know how that would be enforceable. And maybe you know why it failed. Maybe you were actively following what was going on. In conclusion, I feel that the increasing criticism and fear of the criminal justice system and law enforcement are leading us to some very significant challenges. Is there a new chapter, a new initiative that would ensure the rights of victims would be better protected? Who are our partners who are needed for this success? How do we move ahead with strength and enthusiasm? Isn't that the discussion, the real opportunity posed by the observance of this week, National Crime Victims' Rights Week? And where do you go from here?
Wow, Patrick, thank you so much for that wonderful history and those reflections as well. I wonder if anyone wants to chime in with questions, and you can unmute yourself, or you can also type them into the chat, and you can send a question directly to me too if you prefer to not share your identity with everyone. That's totally fine.
I'm also happy if I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yeah, you're fine.
I'm also happy if you would be, if anyone inquires, I'd be happy for you to share my email address so that people could write to me directly,
Oh, yeah.
either with criticism or a suggestion or whatever it might be. Thank you.
Yeah, no, certainly no critique here. It's really interesting to think about the leadership that went into this to make it happen. Oh, Abby, who is in Lincoln County, asked, do you prefer the time of the home visits and the face-to-face meetings compared to now when most of it's done through technology?
Well, I'm old, so I come before the technological era. So I always thought that being able to develop a personal relationship, and by that I meant face to face, in a space that felt comfortable for the person. Obviously, people would often come to our office, and it was a time for meeting with the prosecutor, the DA, or assistant DA, and it was courthouses are strange places. Now they feel, you know, like bunker like. So in my time anyway, when I was engaging with folks, I felt that it was worth my time to go to their home if they were willing. Some people don't want you in their home for a variety of reasons, but I had many home visits with folks, and I thought it was productive.
Yeah, I was curious. You were, I know too, with your work that followed, working on child abuse and neglect. It sounds like a lot of your cases were child abuse cases, but I'm curious, just what your docket looked like generally. What types of cases you were seeing back then?
I don't think it would be much different from today. You know, from time to time, we had experience of serial arsonists. So we'd have multiple arson fires that were committed, plenty of burglaries and thefts, plenty of thefts, aggravated assaults with or without weapons. We had manslaughter cases that we prosecuted. Because of the structure at that time, our offices didn't prosecute homicides. That was all done through the Attorney General's office. But we certainly experienced, and I experienced as a victim witness advocate, death cases in which a family had lost a family member as a result of an accident or an assault. So, gosh, for some reason, there was a period of time when we seemed to specialize in embezzlement cases, so that financial accountants who worked with businesses who were stealing money. I remember an insurance agent who was taking cash payments for insurance coverage and using the money to buy lottery tickets, scratch off lottery tickets, traveling around the county. She was addicted to the excitement of lottery tickets. So I mean, it's in both cases, there were many different types of cases. I haven't even touched on domestic violence, but you know, as of 1981, I believe it was when the domestic violence law went into effect that made it possible for women to apply for and get protections from abuse order. And that was something that I would assist with in making out the statement about why the order was needed. And again, we work closely with the, in our area, it was New Hope for Women. We worked closely with them. We did trainings for volunteers. And I remember seeing that start from the very beginning, where it was one woman who lived in Thomaston, where the Maine State Prison was located. And she began reaching out to women that she knew were associated with men who were in prison, who had been violent, who had been physically and emotionally abusive. And she gathered a collective, which eventually became a very successful coalition for support called New Hope. Anyway, I'm off track. The so what once I believe it was again 81 or 82 when because of presentations that were made in the community and in the news about child sexual abuse, we started getting more and more and more complaints, and that's why it was necessary that we could move to creating a position to have a person who is specifically appointed to assist victims in that process. That was very good. I remember at one point, and I don't think I'm making this up, we were getting 10 to 12 new referrals a week for those types of cases. And it was because the silence was broken. The more the community talked about it, the more people were coming forward, kids talking to teachers, kids talking to friends, friends talking to teachers. So it was overwhelming. It was really overwhelming.
Wow. I've got another couple of really good questions for you from our audience. What's one thing you wish you knew when you began your work as a VWA?
There's a lot to choose from. I mentioned my lack of experience, and in some cases, I think personality characteristics probably have as much to do with success as experience. So I'm basically an introverted person. It's not easy for me to meet people, and so I felt that I had to create a persona which was open and welcoming and inviting dialogue. I also felt for a period of time, I used to muse, wouldn't it be great if I had a gender switch? Because it didn't always work for me that I was a man and I was approaching and trying to engage with a victim, a female victim. I sometimes wished, boy, if I could be a woman, I think this would be easier. I guess, I had a lot to learn about the court process, and I had a lot to learn about recognizing the extreme stress that people are under. And so we did those kinds of court tours that Mr. Atwood talked about. We brought children into the courtroom. They sat in the judge's seat. They ran around. They, did whatever in order to shake off the zoomies. And, we were hopeful that if it came to them being needed to be in court, this would not be a frozen formal kind of place, and maybe they could have an increased level of comfort. So I'm probably touching on many things. There was a lot to learn, and I hope I was up to it.
Yeah. Wow, those are a lot of great reflections on that question. This is a good one. This is something that comes up. This next question, something that I think comes up for most people in this field. How did you handle disagreements you might have had with prosecutors as to how the case was being prosecuted or handled?
That's a great question. So I think what happens, it probably doesn't happen all at once, but relationships form with a prosecutor where whether the DA himself or an assistant can come to rely on you for developing the kind of relationship that will mean that a victim or witness is going to show up when they're needed. And that's complicated. So yeah, there were times when there were disagreements. I mean, I haven't touched it all in my comments about the whole area of what we called in that office sentence bargaining. We never talked about plea bargaining. We were going to get a plea. It's just the question is, what could we get as a sentence? And so, I would often talk with victims about what it is that they would like to see happen. And that ran the gamut from, I don't think he should go to jail, to he ought to be locked up and have the key thrown away. So all I could do would be to honestly convey that to the prosecutor. And I had no leverage to say, well, if you don't do this, she's going to back out, or, whatever it might be. So I could only honestly convey what the victim was telling me. That was the same thing that happened in victim impact statements, that, we had to prepare for court. So we tried not to put so many words in the mouths of the victim, but to say what it was that they felt, how they had been affected, and what they would like to see happen in many cases. So
yeah.
Prosecutors you know, they want to do a good job. All the people that I work for wanted to do a good job. Several of them are now superior court judges or district court judges. They, you know, they knew the importance of being able to have a tight case that could be presented and hopefully be successful.
Yeah.
Am I taking time from Alan Kelly?
Oh, you know what? Actually, Alan wasn't able to make it today, so you actually.
Oh, good. I got more time.
You have more time. You're totally fine. Yeah. Other questions? Does anyone else have a question they want to chime in on? Leanne Zania in the Attorney General's office in the criminal division says hello. I think she said that she used to work with you, probably when you were a prosecutorial assistant.
Her name again?
Leanne Zania.
Oh, yeah. So she's a prosecutor. Yeah, she used to be one of our assistant DAs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Oh, there's a really nice comment. Thank you for your wonderful insight into the history of victims' rights and advocacy. It offers hope when we can see where and how far victim rights and advocacy have come, even though we still have a ways to go. Thank you, Patrick, for your devotion to advocacy on so many levels. And this is a nice question, I think, to close with. Do you have specific cases or success stories that stick with you?
Nothing comes readily to mind. I mean, I would think that we would count success as being a case that was resolved where the victim felt okay about the outcome. And I know that over time, even, you know, my short period as a VWA, a lot of things changed. I mentioned the return of property that was seized as evidence. There was no good reason that those things needed to be in most cases, those things needed to be in a secure location in the courthouse. So we gradually over time won the right to take good, clear photographs of the evidence and get them back to the victim. I mean, we had power tools and guns and things that had a lot of value that the prior practice had been just to hold on to. So, you know, I felt like some of the things that we were doing over time to improve the experience of victims was the greatest success. It might not be a specific case or, you know, something that I feel, you know, overly glad about.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like another big success, I would think. And it's certainly carried through today. For victims to be able to get their things back in a more timely way anyway.
Yeah.
There is a question about legal toolkits for advocates to support the people they're working with without providing a legal opinion. And I'm not sure if this is a question that you would be able to answer, given that you're not working in domestic violence advocacy now and haven't worked with domestic violence survivors for a long time. But I think that's something that the folks at MCDB, so the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, definitely would have support for you, Marissa, who's asked this question. But yeah, I think we've come to a great place to wrap up today. Again, thank you so much for taking the time today, Patrick. This has been super enlightening, and I know the folks on really appreciate it. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and for those who joined us today, we'll see you tomorrow if you can make it. We're going to talk about the history of domestic violence community-based advocacy and talk about new programming and opportunities. So thank you. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Take care.